My life was never the same after my father passed away from cancer. No one can prepare for a loss that immense, especially when my mother was also battling the same cruel disease. I had to become the rock for my family, but what no one knew was that to survive, I had to walk a dark path. My relationship with Jessica, the woman I loved, was supposed to be my escape, but it quickly turned into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. When? You'll have to keep listening to this story to find out. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. I was 19 when my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Things were very challenging with my mom working 9 to 9. I took the job of caring for him after a long 4-year battle with cancer. He passed away after a triple bypass surgery. My dad's passing completely changed my mom. I tried to be strong for her and me. These were indeed dark times, and they changed me completely. I didn't focus on school and my grades slept. I also had to work an after-school job to support my mom because she was a wreck. Something changed inside of me. I had lived a somewhat sheltered life due to regularly attending church and church activities. When my father passed, if I wanted to go to college, I would have to pay for it out of pocket. I did not qualify for any loans with everything at home and the constant demand for extra cash. My crap job paid me a minimum wage that got us nowhere. A friend introduced me to drugs. He told me if I needed the extra cash, I could come work for him and his buddies. They were drug dealers, and eventually I started to deliver coke for them. After some months of pushing coke, I raised enough money. I finished high school with enough money to fund college. I was several years into college. I never bought flashy clothes or threw money around to impress anyone. I kept as low a profile as I could, and I finished my BA degree in 3 years due to having plenty of free time. I initially wanted to be a lawyer, but I had known far too many corrupt cops and officials pushing coke. I did study law, but had no goal of ever passing the bar because I wanted to become and eventually became a paralegal. I reacquainted with a high school classmate named Jessica in college. We were close in high school. I discovered she and I had both had crushes on each other back in the day, but we were both too shy to say anything to each other. Without going into too many irrelevant details, suffice it to say Jessica and I became friends, best friends even. We fell head over heels in love and were planning a future together. Both of our previous relationships had been total failures, mine in particular. It had left me feeling completely dead inside, as if I was incapable of loving. It had been years since I had dated on purpose. My previous ex, I will call Sarah, had done cold and heartless things to cause our breakup. I was good to her, saving her from an abusive relationship, never abusing her and teaching her that no human deserves to be used. But she left me broken and in shambles. Finding Jessica gave me hope, but it also made me recognize that every relationship before her had failed me. Jessica was the love of my life. We were meant to be together. We took it slowly at first. 2 years passed, and I opened more and more to her. I told her what had happened with Sarah, my dad, and all. She sympathized with me, and she was very empathetic. We started sleeping together and eventually became a couple. She seemed to appreciate that I actually listened, spoke honestly, and was protective of her. She said she loved me, and I admitted that I loved her. I never told her how I'd paid for college or the things I'd seen her done. She didn't need to know. I was afraid it had ruined things with her. We loved each other and already had plans to start a family. A few months later, disaster struck. My mother had a terrible accident. She was crushed by a large shelving unit. It was pretty bad. She was taken to the hospital by the neighbors who found her. She had to undergo some medical tests. She sustained many injuries and a few broken bones. It was discovered that my mom had a leaking heart valve. The tests were to see if they could repair the valve a week later. We got the good news that the valve could be replaced, but we also got bad news. During the test, they identified 5 small masses in and around her left kidney, with a high probability that the masses were tumors and malignant. The doctors did a biopsy to discover. She did in fact have renal kidney cancer. She began treatment, and I knew I had to stay focused on my mother. Things had been going great with Jessica. We had moved in together. It was a town about 30 miles from my mom's when I told Jessica about my mother. She expressed concern and support when I explained it meant we would see less of each other. She assured me that she had no desire to put things between us on hold. She said she wanted to be there for me in no other way than as emotional support. I urged Jessica that if she decided she wanted to take a break or thought she might be interested in anyone she met, to say so to me and I would understand. She assured me that she cherished me and that nobody could ever take my place. My mom started chemo. Initially, the chemotherapy seemed to have none of the horrible side effects. It was well into her second month before she noticed weakness and a loss of appetite. I talked to and texted Jessica multiple times per day, every day. She would message me asking how my mom was doing as soon as she woke up each morning. And we often spent hours before falling asleep talking and telling each other how much we were missed. We got to see and spend the night together about every 2 weeks, but everything seemed fine when we did. My mom's condition worsened, so I told Jessica that she could go out with friends and enjoy life as summer began. I knew Jessica would enjoy going to outdoor activities even without me. My mom's failing health that summer meant no fun in the sun for me. Jessica would go out with friends, and I enjoyed hearing about the silly things she and her friends did. I was genuinely glad she wasn't a shut-in over issues in my life. She always expressed concern and sadness when I told her what was happening with my mom. The chemo was killing the cancer cells. However, she was growing frailer and frailer. I realized cancer was no longer destroying my mother. The medicine was, I needed to take a break, so a group of my mom's friends came to sit with her to give me a little free time on my own. I called Jessica as I was nearing her town. She gave me the address of where she and her friends were to meet them. When I arrived, I saw most of her friends, which I'd already met as I made my way through the house to the back deck. I saw a guy sitting close to Jessica. They were both laughing and cutting up with other friends. She introduced me as her boyfriend to the guy. We will call Ryan. He gave me a firm handshake. He said, I'm happy to meet you. I acted politely towards him. I don't think Jessica realized I felt something was fishy with Ryan right away. I'm sure many people have a gut feeling when encountering someone suspicious. Because of my criminal activity many years ago, I guess it takes one to know one. My instinct told me there was something shady about Ryan. I knew he was new to their group of friends. None of them, including Jessica, had known him longer than a couple of months. To be clear, what I was experiencing at the time was not jealousy, as I now realize. Jessica had many male friends, all of whom I genuinely liked, but there was something I sensed about Ryan that made me a bit skeptical about his character. I tried to ignore it, writing the feeling off as mere jealousy. I began to talk with Jessica and her friends, trying to put my mind at ease. I monitored Ryan from afar and interacted with him warmly. Jessica and I stayed at her place that night before I had to leave and head home. Over the next several weeks, my mother's condition began to worsen. Still, Jessica and I spoke and texted throughout the day, every day. In hindsight, I realize now that I was initiating most of our communication, but at the time, I wasn't keeping count. One day, a few relatives volunteered to look after my mom to give me a break. I headed to see Jessica, calling her on the way. She told me what restaurant she and her friends were having dinner at, so I made my way there. I was pulling into a parking space and saw Ryan get into a late-model black Buick. He pulled out, though. He did not see me. Unfamiliar with my car, I made my way inside, where Jessica and her friends greeted me with hugs and words of sympathy and encouragement. We all had dinner and a few drinks before Jessica and I went back to her place. Before bed, I casually asked why Ryan had left before I got to say hello. Jessica stated she had no idea and didn't know if Ryan had even been at the restaurant. The restaurant we'd eaten at was in a strip mall with several other businesses. I thought perhaps he had come out of one of those stores and neither Jessica nor her friends had seen him. At any rate, I again stayed with her that night before heading back to my place around noon the next day. My mother became critically ill and had to be transported to the hospital by ambulance. She had pneumonia and was extremely weak due to the chemo, making her susceptible to many ailments. For 3 weeks, she was hospitalized. They gave her many medications via an IV, but her condition worsened each day. It wasn't good seeing her like that. The doctors finally informed me she had at most a week or so to live. I knew she would not want to leave this earth in that gloomy hospital room. So the staff arranged to bring her home and help me make her last few days as peaceful as possible. When everything was set up, we got my mom home. Though extremely weak, she was glad to see her house and be in familiar surroundings. Once again, we both knew she didn't have much longer to live. While she was afraid, she told me she wanted to be strong for me and also said she was ready to go and see my dad once again after so long. I got one of my mom's friends from church to look after her for a few hours, got in my car, and drove to see Jessica without calling. I hadn't called because I was crying hard watching my mom suffer. It was overwhelming. I wouldn't have been able to speak. When I arrived, because of my mother's impending death, I knew Jessica would know what to say to comfort me. I got to Jessica's house and saw a black Buick parked behind her car. I didn't think anything of it, as I was focused on soon losing my dear mother. I used the key she had given me to enter through the kitchen, as we always did. I heard music playing as soon as the door opened, but I didn't think much of it because I didn't see anyone in the living room or on the back porch. As I walked down the hallway toward her bedroom, I heard noises coming from inside. I stopped. I realized the sounds I heard were sexual. My heart sank even further as I pulled back my hand, not wanting to draw attention. But slowly, I put my hand on the lock and opened the door a crack. I stopped in my tracks as I saw them completely naked, going at it, unaware of my presence. Honestly, my first instinct was to run full speed and headbutt him square on his nose. But I knew I had to stay out of trouble for my mother's sake and my job. So I slowly backed away, shaking with anger. I went out of the house through the back and to my car. I wasn't seen. I just sat there in my car, the weight of everything caving in, bawling my eyes out after about half an hour. I cranked my car and headed back to my mom's. I told no one what I'd just seen. Everyone assumed my tears were totally regarding my mom. They of course partially were, but the betrayal I just witnessed was like something so sadistic. I struggled to grasp it. My logic knew my mom was my top priority, especially so close to the end, yet I felt so deceived by Jessica. I felt the rage like I'd never known before, and I'd felt plenty of anger. I thought of calling her, letting her know what I'd seen and cursing her out. But I knew if she didn't care enough to be faithful to me while my mother was on her deathbed, a stream of profanity wouldn't bother her. I made sure my mother was comfortable and went to try and sleep in my old childhood room. I cried. I slept. I woke up crying, and I cried some more throughout the night. I woke to my cell phone ringing and saw it was Jessica calling. I ignored the call and the urge to slam the phone against the wall. I went in to check on my mom, who was in a deep sleep due to the morphine they had her on. I managed to text Jessica that I was very busy with my mom and would call her later. After forcing myself to eat and take a shower, the hospice nurses came by to check on my mom. After checking her vital signs, they informed me that my mother would die within 48 hours. I thanked them and walked out into the backyard, trying not to lose my mind completely with all that had happened and was about to happen. I managed to text Jessica and told her my mother's condition was about the same, and I didn't want to see her, didn't want to talk to her, and didn't want her showing up. I owed it to my mom to do everything I could to ensure her last moments were as peaceful as possible. The next evening, just before 6 p.m., my mother took her last breath with me by her side, holding her hand as her life expired. The next 3 days were spent in meetings with her pastor and making final touches on the church and burial service. But I could not, for the life of me, get the images of Jessica and Ryan having sex out of my head. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I was mad at Jessica, furious. But remembering how Ryan had been so overly friendly toward me made my blood boil even more. If they hadn't already been intimate when I first met him, they were soon about to be. That made me want to know just exactly who the son of a bleep was. I paid a private investigator to run background checks on Ryan, just as I'd sensed from the moment I met him. He was bad news. I was actually angry at myself for ignoring my gut instincts. The private investigator, a friend from the firm I worked for, got back to me after a week with a file on Ryan. There were mugshots of Ryan from many years before. I was once arrested and have done some despicable things in my life. I've known people who have done horrible things, both intentionally and under the influence of various drugs and substances. Still, Ryan had a long rap sheet for various crimes, several DWIs, reckless driving, receiving stolen goods, breaking and entering, and drug arrests. As I moved down through his record and the arrests became more atrocious, I discovered Ryan had been out of prison on early probation for approximately 2 years after serving 10 years. When I saw the charges, my stomach turned. They included sexual exploitation of a minor and a host of other sexual offenses. I admit I was disgusted. Jessica had betrayed me, which hurt enough. But the knowledge that she may have risked exposing me to God only knew what diseases that Felon may have contracted as a sex predator and later in prison, made me feel physically ill. I doubted Jessica had any idea who she was involved with behind my back. She had a naive, trusting nature that had given her issues before, but never like this. I had no doubt that anyone who knew of Ryan's record would have considered him a vile creature. He should have never been let out of prison. But I had my mom's funeral to focus on and had to pull myself together. By the time her funeral was over and everyone had left, I was exhausted and mentally spent. As I put my head on the pillow to try to sleep, Jessica called. She didn't know my mom had passed or that I knew what she had been up to. She'd been texting and calling much less in the days before my discovery and after. I answered the phone and tried my best to sound as glad to hear from her as I could. I didn't let on that anything had changed with my mom's status, nor that I knew about her and Ryan or what I knew about Ryan. I let her do most of the talking and internalized every word I knew to be a lie, as if I totally believed her and appreciated her false sympathy. When she claimed she missed me, I responded in kind. As we said goodbye, I lied and told her the same. But in all honesty, at that moment, if she had dropped dead, I would not have cared in the least. I had a few weeks off from work with bereavement leave. I knew things with Jessica were over and done with, but part of me couldn't help but struggle with how cruelly she had treated me. Intentionally or not, I was glad to know the truth about her and Ryan before any further lies and betrayal could occur. But I felt what both of them had done to me at a time when I was struggling to keep it together was just flat out wrong. I wanted revenge. I wanted to destroy both of their lives and yet never let either know I had any part of it. I called my Human Resources department and filled out the necessary FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act paperwork to extend my leave beyond the given 2 weeks. I honestly had no reason to worry about getting fired, but I took the legal route and had enough saved to pay my bills for half a year or more if necessary. I needed to have my revenge on Ryan. It was quite easy, as he was on parole and a felon. Even a minor charge would get him sent back to prison to finish his original sentence. But I didn't want him to just have to finish out his original sentence. I wanted new charges that would bring him so much time behind bars that he'd never see freedom again. I'd met his parole officer on many occasions, and she knew me well enough that if I had called, she would have investigated Ryan. With a record like his, I knew he'd have difficulty gaining employment. If he had a job, I had my doubts. He was gainfully employed in something legal to be able to afford a new Buick, and insurance I parked down the street from Jessica's in a car she would not be familiar with. I saw Ryan's Buick in her driveway. I sat in silence and waited. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard him start his engine. Before pulling off from her driveway, I casually followed him, not wanting him to suspect he was being followed. It was time I did some digging of my own, maintaining a reasonable distance. I followed the signal to a cruddy-looking house in a below-average part of Jessica's town. His car was parked and he'd already gone inside. I wrote down the license plate number and parked down the street. I slept several hours in view of his house after seeing no activity. I slept at about 8 in the morning. I got out of the car and bought some breakfast throughout the day. It was easy to tell whether Ryan had a large group of friends who saw no reason to stay and talk for long, or he was dealing with a highly addictive substance such as cocaine, heroin, or meth. After a few hours, many customers returned for more of the narcotics. Obviously, he was selling, and I took photos of the cars that stopped by, along with some video. I went back each day at about the same time to document the continuing activity. I also observed each night at about 6 p.m. when I knew Jessica was getting off work. He would leave. I trailed him each night to see him meet Jessica at a restaurant or go straight to her house. I had major doubts she'd ever been to his house, at least not at that house. I had enough evidence to turn into the local police, but I decided to document Ryan's activities for one more day. I knew he hadn't been out to get more drugs to sell that last day. I staked out his house around 3 p.m. People stopped coming by, which was unusual. I sat and observed when, about 30 minutes later, a large black Cadillac Escalade pulled into his driveway. Typically, I had seen no more than one person get out of a vehicle to go into his house. This time, I observed 3 large males exit the vehicle and open the back door to escort a middle-aged man inside. They stayed in Ryan's house for over 2 hours, something nobody else had done. I was fairly certain the middle-aged man was his source for the drugs he was selling. I drove by and took a picture of the Escalade's license tag. At home, I downloaded the photos and videos I had taken of Ryan's activities to my computer. I made a detailed report citing the activity from the 4 days I had observed what was going on. When I finished, I printed out 38 pages of photos of people heading for Ryan's door to buy drugs. I saved all the video recordings to a SIM card and placed it in a small plastic box for safekeeping. I knew it wouldn't take much to convince the police of what Ryan was up to. I was giving the cops actual admissible evidence with timestamps on each photo and video. But I wanted to put so much heat on him that the police would be the least of his worries. The next morning, I went by the town's police station in Jessica's town. I calmly walked in, requesting to speak with someone in their narcotics division. A uniformed officer came out from the office section. I shook his hand and handed him one of my business cards. He stared at the card for several seconds and asked about 2 of the lawyers at the firm I worked for. The cop knew the business card carried quite a bit of clout, even if I had never passed the bar exam. I told him I had some information he might want to look at. The detective happily led me back to a conference room where we made small talk about mutual acquaintances. Soon I pushed a folder of paperwork in the box with the SIM card across the table toward him. Listed on the first page was Ryan's first name, date of birth, criminal record, and parole officer. The detective examined the photos while I sat quietly. By the expressions on his face, he realized he'd been given information that could easily lead to an arrest warrant. He must have also imagined how much narcotics those arrests could get off the street, along with potential promotions and other positives. He thanked me for the evidence and placed the folder back down on the table. He asked if I would be willing to testify. I explained that the evidence was damning enough so I wouldn't have to. He smiled and casually asked if there was anything I needed. I explained that I felt Ryan had been let out of prison far too soon. It was apparent he had not been rehabilitated and deserved to go back to jail for much longer. The detective agreed, but again asked what I wanted in exchange for the information. I pulled out a photo of the black Escalade with the license plate number and pushed it toward him. I asked him to write the tag number down for his own benefit. I explained that the owner of the Escalade might be an even bigger drug dealer. I reaffirmed that I wanted my name kept out of any police or court reports. He agreed. I then lied and said my firm was representing someone who might have been set up by the owner of the Escalade. He knew I could have gotten one of the lawyers in my firm to call in a favor for the info, but he also knew lawyers like to use their favors sparingly. He thought quietly for a few seconds, realizing I'd given him yet another lead to follow. I'd done more detective work in 5 days than his entire staff had done in months. So, he happily agreed. 10 minutes later, he returned with a printout of the tag with the name and address of the owner. I folded the printout and put it into my pocket. The detective and I made some more small talk about sports and cars before I shook his hand and headed out to my car. I drove home, knowing a judge would soon be filling out an arrest warrant for that scumbag Ryan. I kept to myself for a few days, monitoring the arrest reports from the local newspaper online. One morning, the front page showed a photo of a very bewildered and confused Ryan being led away in handcuffs. As long as nobody had made any stupid errors to get him off on a technicality, he'd be finishing out his original sentence plus many additional years. There was always the possibility he might get a good lawyer to reduce the charges or find some loophole to get him off scot-free. I couldn't and wouldn't let that happen. I hadn't been driving for 10 minutes when my phone rang. The caller ID let me know it was Jessica. When I answered, I tried to act surprised and happy to hear from her. Without even a friendly greeting, she asked how I could not have let her know my mother had passed away. She had seen the obituary in my city's newspaper. I replied that it seemed she had been busy enjoying life and that I didn't want to burden her with my grief. I quickly asked why she hadn't been texting and calling as much lately, which led her to change the subject and ask to see me. I tried my hardest to act happy to hear from her and told her that I missed her. I asked her if she could meet me for dinner at our favorite restaurant in town, and she readily agreed. Since Ryan was no longer around to occupy her time, she was glad to have me back to fill the void. I showed up to dinner with a smile and gave her a long hug, trying to control the urge to break her spine in half. I was surprised she didn't say anything when I avoided kissing her. I'm sure she assumed that, in my grief, romance wasn't something on my mind. Honestly, I just had a very good idea of what her mouth had been doing. and I didn't want Ryan's prison germs on me. We sat at the bar and ordered 2 drinks from our favorite bartender. He knew us as a couple because we always tipped very well. When our drinks arrived, I excused myself to the restroom and typed a short message on my phone that read, "Make my drinks with no alcohol and make hers doubles." When I returned to the bar, I sat next to Jessica, sipping my drink and acting as if everything was perfectly fine. We'd enjoyed it, but hadn't tried it in quite a while. I acted as if I was pulling up the recipe for some unusual drink. The bartender came over and asked if we were ready for another drink. I told him we were celebrating after not seeing each other for quite a while. I held up my phone for him to read the message asking if he knew how to make that drink. He read the message and smiled, agreeing the drink. I'd request it was a specialty of his. I'm sure the bartender and Jessica assumed she could get as sloshed as she wanted to, and that she'd be heading to her place with me afterward. I had other plans, commented how strong hers was. I told her I could barely taste the alcohol in mine. We ordered several more drinks. Jessica commented about how drunk she felt. I act confused, stating I barely felt a buzz at all. After several hours, I paid for our dinner and drinks with a sizable tip as we exited the door. I acted like I'd gotten a very important call that I needed to take after the obligatory non-existent phone call. I told her I had to rush back to my town to the office. One of the lawyers needed me for a case early the next morning. I asked to go to her house and wait on me. Promising the errand wouldn't take long, I helped her into her car and watched her pull off before using my cell phone to immediately call the police and tell them I'd seen a drunk driver leaving that restaurant. I urged him to hurry. The person was in no shape to be driving. I jumped into my car and headed to Jessica's house about 2 miles away, about a mile from her house. I saw blue lights ahead of me and slowed down to see Jessica's car pull over. I knew she was going to get a DWI, as that is in fact what I had planned. Neither she nor I knew that Ryan had been using her car to deliver cocaine to low-level dealers under him. They did the obligatory search of Jessica's car and found several ounces of cocaine stashed beneath the back seat. I had absolutely no intention of getting her arrested for narcotics possession, with intent to sell. But the fact Jessica had given me her spare car key the same night, she'd given her spare house key. I knew well, I could have just as quickly been the one to screw my life up. Neither still had any idea I knew about her. Unscrupulous cheating that was revealed to all. Wider update. I arrived back at my house that day and my cell phone rang from a strange number. I answered to hear Jessica crying and blubbering while trying to tell me something. I got her to calm down. I actually wanted to hear what she had to say. She managed to tell me she was in jail, to which I innocently asked where and for what. When she told me that she had been arrested for, I was genuinely shocked about the drug arrests. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She wanted me to help her get out and asked me to post bond. I explained since my mom had died, I couldn't risk putting up any of my property due to probate issues. I could have easily put my own home up as collateral, but I viewed her drug charges as collateral damage, and she damaged my life enough that the charges for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute carried mandatory time. I felt after what she'd done to me with who she betrayed me with, part of her deserved what was coming to her. I went to her arraignment and sat in the back, hoping not to be noticed as she entered the courtroom. I gave her a look of confusion as to how she could ever be arrested for such a crime. I knew dang well how, of course. But I had to act totally oblivious when she tried to explain to the judge her boyfriend had been eschewed for dealing drugs only days before and it had to be his. The judge didn't want to hear it. She turned around and looked at me with shame and tears in her eyes, realizing I knew she'd been cheating. I shook my head in disgust as they led her away. She knew in the attempt to contact me ever again would be a fool's errand. Bond was set extremely high for both and Ryan as he pled guilty and asked to forego a trial in an attempt for leniency, but he got none. Jessica's trial took place a few weeks later and she accepted a plea. She got 4 years with the possibility of parole in 3, but her career was over when she got out, and I didn't care one bit. They'd mess with the worst person they could have ever crossed at the absolute worst time to cross me. After everything had happened, I initially thought that the story was over, that I had completed my mission and could finally move on. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that weighed heavily on me. Sure, I had achieved my goal. I had seen the consequences of her actions unfold before me in that courtroom. Seeing her eyes filled with shame and regret was exactly what I had wanted to witness. It was a form of justice, wasn't it? She was being held accountable, and in theory, I should have felt relieved, even triumphant. But the truth was, I didn't. I felt drained. It wasn't the victory I thought it would be. No, it was something else entirely. It was the realization that the price I had paid to get here was far higher than I ever anticipated. The cost was more than just the effort of planning and executing my revenge. It was the part of me that I had lost along the way. All the anger, all the rage, the hours spent tracking, documenting, waiting it had slowly eroded something inside of me. I wasn't the person I was before all of this started. I stood there that day, in the quiet of my living room, looking around at the familiar surroundings. Everything was as it had always been. The house was the same, the furniture untouched. Yet it felt so foreign to me. A cold emptiness surrounded me, like a fog that wouldn't lift. It wasn't just the absence of my mother, it was the absence of the man I used to be. I had no one to share this pain with anymore. I looked at the chair where she used to sit every evening, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. How could everything have changed so much? How had I gotten here? And most importantly, how could I undo what had been done? I found myself wishing, just for a moment, that I could go back in time. Just once more, I wanted to feel the warmth of love and comfort, to feel like I wasn't alone. But that was impossible now. All I had was the haunting memory of her betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, it wasn't her face I saw. It was the painful reminder of everything she had done, of everything I had been forced to witness. It wasn't the woman I loved staring back at me. It was the memory of someone who had deceived me in the worst possible way. That pain had become a part of me, and no matter how much time passed, it wouldn't disappear. The more I reflected on everything, the more I realized that revenge didn't offer the freedom I thought it would. It didn't make me feel better. It didn't heal me. In fact, it did the opposite. It kept me trapped in the past. I had done what I set out to do. I had taken back control. But in doing so, I had also lost control of myself. I hadn't defeated her or him. I had only defeated myself. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me weren't just directed at them. They had begun to poison me. I had become a version of myself that I didn't even recognize. But then something inside me shifted. I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could change how I move forward. I had spent so much time trying to make them pay for what they had done, but in the process, I had forgotten about myself. I had forgotten what really mattered. I couldn't go back and undo the past, no matter how much I wished I could, but I could choose to let go of the anger. I could choose to start healing. The real breakthrough came when I understood something important. Revenge, while it might bring temporary relief, would never truly set me free. Only forgiveness could do that. Not just forgiving them, but forgiving myself. I had carried so much anger for so long, thinking that if I could make them pay, I would feel better. But that wasn't the answer. The real freedom lay in letting go of that anger and choosing to move forward with a sense of peace. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness is never easy, especially when the pain runs so deep. But it was the only way for me to move on and find peace again. It wasn't about excusing what had happened or pretending that everything was okay. It was about finding the strength to let go of the hurt that had weighed me down for so long. As I thought about it, I realized that the journey ahead wasn't about exacting more revenge or seeking closure. It was about rebuilding my life piece by piece. I would no longer let the betrayal define me. It wasn't going to be easy, but I had to start somewhere. And the first step was forgiveness. Forgiveness for what had happened, and for myself for allowing myself to be consumed by the darkness of revenge. So from that moment forward, I made a promise to myself. I would find a new path, a path not of anger and retribution, but one of healing and self-discovery. I would learn to live again without the burden of past pain holding me back. It wouldn't happen overnight, and there would be days when it felt impossible. But I knew it was the only way, and I knew that eventually I would find peace in my heart once more. One day when I looked back at everything that had happened, I would no longer feel regret. I would feel at peace. Peace with myself and with the choices I made. And that, I realized, was the real victory. This story is not just a lesson about betrayal and revenge, but also a testament to the power of perseverance and resilience during the darkest times of life. Sometimes we are faced with challenges that seem impossible to overcome. The losses, the shocks, and the betrayals can make us feel lost and uncertain. But it is in those moments that we truly discover our inner strength. Life isn't always fair, but what matters most is that we rise up and keep moving forward, no matter what. Remember, no matter how tough or painful things get, there is always a way forward. Stay strong in your belief in yourself and never give up on your dreams. My story is proof that no matter how dark life may seem, eventually you will find the light. If you found this story intriguing and want to hear more intense, gripping tales, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.